As we discussed, the early state constitutions were written in the spirit of '76, a spirit of radical whiggery that rejected mixed government and tried to represent the people's will as directly as possible. Now, a decade later, let's see how democracy in the states is working. The eyes of the world were upon the American experiment, for as Alexander Hamilton said, it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide whether societies of men are really capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend on accident and force. And the verdict? Disappointment. Those who were hoping for reflection and choice found little. It's not just that the Articles of Confederation were defective. There seemed to be deeper problems with the democratic process itself. There's a book on my shelf called Righteous Anger at the Wicked States, and really all you need to know is the title. It captures the mood of the moment perfectly. The sense among our founding fathers was, we're squandering our chance. If this is the best we can show Europe, no wonder they laugh at democracy. Now, there's always a bit of a historian's dilemma here. History remembers the state constitutions as deeply flawed, but history is also written by the winners, and in this case, the winners are the Federalists who supported the U.S. Constitution, and they, for the most part, had disdain for the state governments. For example, James Madison, the mutability, or constant change, of the laws of the states is a serious evil. Their injustice alarms even the most steadfast friends of republicanism. Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia, the powers of government exercised by the people swallows up the other branches. None of the constitutions have provided sufficient checks against the democracy. Gouverneur Morris, and yes, Gouverneur is his first name. What if all the charters and constitutions of the states were thrown into the fire and all their demagogues into the ocean? So, what had happened? With the British authorities cut loose, there was a power vacuum in the states. And who stepped up but new men? Socially insignificant, inexperienced nobodies gained high office overnight. Many of them came from humble origins. They were recent arrivals from the British Isles, or they were from the back country. Not respectable people from the city, but hicks. For many of the framers, their defining political experience was spending time in the state legislatures surrounded by these upstarts who lacked education or knowledge of public affairs. So the million-dollar question is, was the Founding Fathers' distaste for the state governments about bad governance? Or was it snobbery? Or was it both? There's certainly evidence for the snob theory. Check out the frustrations of Governor Samuel Johnston of North Carolina. Everyone who has the least pretensions to be a gentleman is borne down per ignobile vulgus by the common crowd, a set of men without reading, experience, or principles to govern them. You can tell from the use of Latin that Samuel Johnston saw himself as far above the common man. The people who wrote all these complaints about the states are not representative of all Americans. They're the upper class, the plantation owners, the merchants, the lawyers. Their view of the critical period is going to be very different from, say, a poor farmer's perspective. I think the viewpoint of these men is overrepresented in history, in part because they left us so many more written texts than common people. Nonetheless, in this lecture I'm going to tell the story from the upper class point of view, presenting their ideas and complaints as they saw it, because these are the men who wrote the Constitution, and I want you to see what was on their minds. There were serious concerns about the way these state governments functioned. The legislatures were too populist, too responsive to the whims of the majority. A majority of citizens could simply impose its will without building consensus. Inexperienced lawmakers were sloppy in their drafting, leading to the need for constant revisions. This, on top of too much responsiveness to an ever-shifting public, resulted in far too much legislation being passed too quickly. And moreover, there was no truly independent check on legislative power. I'll run through some of the most infamous examples of the above. First, the states were downright beastly to loyalists. those who did not side with the Patriot cause, but instead remained faithful to the British. Men who took this risk were in danger of having their estates seized and their families impoverished. Many states passed what were called confiscation acts, which were bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is an act of legislation that singles out particular individuals for punishment without any sort of judicial process. Some of these confiscation acts would list dozens of names of loyalists who would have to forfeit their land. States also passed laws that canceled debts owed to British creditors. Well, this is terrible for our foreign policy. It runs directly against the Treaty of Paris, the peace treaty with Great Britain, which specifically says that debts shall be respected and land seized shall be returned. Oh, and then of course no one in Europe will loan us money, almost no one. Who would be foolish enough to with a credit rating like ours? The greatest arena where fear of an overpowered majority played out was the fear that the more numerous poor would exploit the rich minority. Madison, in Federalist 10, writes openly of a class struggle. The poor majority are abusing government to tear down the wealthy, to forgive their own debts, to stiff their wealthy creditors. The policies Madison specifically condemns are a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property. Just to explain the paper money, the idea is that by printing lots of money, the state can help its citizens inflate their way out of debt. Through inflation, if you owe somebody $1,000, it's much easier to pay that back when the value of the dollar has gone down and every dollar is worth less. Paper money enables this because you can just print more of it. Rhode Island was especially famous for this, printing a huge amount of money and declaring, voila, our debts are paid off. So of course no one would sell goods to Rhode Island because their currency was worthless.
Now, I'm going to break character for a moment. Clearly, Madison is motivated by class-based concerns. His heart goes out to the wealthy creditors. Meanwhile, the common man, the poor man struggling to pay his debts, is presented as the villain of this story. This makes it really easy for later generations to say, hey, weren't the framers just rich guys looking after their own interests? They, of course, were the ones who suffered when inflation made their stockpiles of wealth less valuable. Okay, now I'm going back into character.
It would be one thing if there were any outside check on these policies, but by weakening executives and judiciaries so much compared with legislatures, the states had nearly killed the checks and balances that were the pride of English government. Madison again says, the legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex, using the memorable imagery of a whirlpool. And if this weren't enough, there's one final concern about the state systems. The state legislatures can alter the Constitution itself. That is, there's nothing that sets apart the state constitution as higher law. Higher law simply being law that is fundamental and primary over some other law, over ordinary day-to-day law. Please note, it's not the same as natural law. When I say higher law, I mean law that's man-made and usually written down, like a constitution. So, how were these state constitutions passed? Most were simply passed as though they were ordinary acts of legislation. But that suggests, couldn't the legislature change them just as easily? Is it even possible to call things constitutional or unconstitutional in a system like this? If you have Law A on the books and then you pass Law B which contradicts it in some way, you wouldn't say you had violated Law A, you would just say you replaced it with something newer. So then the legislature, the branch that most needs to be checked, cannot be contained by a constitution. There is one state that's a notable exception, and this is major foreshadowing. Massachusetts did things differently. They don't have their legislature just pass the Constitution. They send it out to the people to meet in these conventions, and they have it ratified by the people's vote. Now, that's a way to set something apart as higher law. This law is special. It has the people's stamp of approval. The legislature isn't going to mess with that. Overall, the critical period after the war has been won is a major disappointment for those who harbored high hopes for American government. Change is in the air. As Richard Henry Lee wrote, the minds of men have been so hurt by the injustice, folly, and wickedness of the state legislatures and state executives that people in general seem ready for anything. Frustration was a long time building, but it's not hard to pinpoint the final straw, Shays' Rebellion, when farmers from Massachusetts rose up against state government. And remember, this was in what was considered a well-governed state. Sloppy or chaotic lawmaking was one thing, but if the states couldn't even preserve order, something had to be done. It was the end of the spirit of '76. Radical Whig ideas didn't have the answers. You could not continue to make representative government more direct and popular, because at the end all you had was rule by the mob. Instead, the checks and balances of the old British system began to look more and more appealing. But remember, that was a product of mixed government. We don't have a rigid class system. There's no nobility for a House of Lords to represent. We can't have a mixed government. James Wilson at the Constitutional Convention says it best, the British government cannot be our model. We have no materials for a similar one. Our manners, our laws, the whole genius of the people are opposed to it. So is there a way of creating meaningful checks and balances and limiting government while keeping the system strictly Republican?